She was middle-aged like July, and just as pleasant and full of fireworks as that month tends to be. She was, of course, not actually full of celebratory explosives. If this had been the case, she would have needed to seek immediate medical attention. And, well, in reality, she did need immediate medical attention, but not because of the metaphorical fireworks. The reason the woman was being rushed into a sterile, crowded hospital was due to the van that hit her nearly half an hour before. It is, generally speaking, not good to be hit by a van. This happened to be one of those typical times where getting hit by a van was very bad. Dr. Fry did what he could and he hoped for the best, but Dr. Fry couldn't do a lot and wasn't the best. So even after a few hours of sticking impressive needles into random veins, attaching tangled tubes carrying who knows what into her body, and wrapping every part of her mostly purple skin with a vast variety of bandages, he knew she wouldn't make it much longer. Dr. Fry felt that the woman should not spend the evening alone, but was, unfortunately, an extremely impersonal and cold sort of person. He was at least self-aware enough to realize that he would not make her dying breaths any less lonely. In fact, it was often said that many of the patients that had died during his unsuccessful career had done so due to the fact that he was, for most people, the exact embodiment of what they felt death personified was like. The theory goes that upon seeing death in person, most patients quickly accepted that their fate was unavoidable, so they hurried up and died. Being the ridiculously out-of-touch man that he was, the doctor then decided that he would force the driver of the van that hit her to come be with her as her life ended. The postman arrived red-eyed. He was younger than his scraggly face and calloused hands let on. With cheeks flushed from the autumn air, he held a bouquet of flowers that looked suspiciously similar to the ones lining the hospital parking lot. They'd been wrapped in various bills and eviction notices. He had been fired very quickly after the accident, and had decided that he would not do the United States Postal Service the kindness of bringing back their customers' letters, or at least not the ones he needed to wrap the flowers in. His 10-minute decade of a waiting room visit was finally cut off, and he went inside the woman's room. She was awake now. She looked at him. The postman didn't know what to say. Hitting people with a vehicle was not a preferred pastime of his. A preferred pastime of his was doing origami with other people's mail. If he had been faced with a paper fish made from a coupon for almond milk, he would have known exactly what to say. Nothing. But the woman was not a paper fish. She was somebody who likely did want him to say something. So he did. He said something. "I've seen you before. You live in that brick house with the garden on the porch. I deliver a lot of letters from people in France and India to you." The postman started crying instantly. There was something terribly tragic about some French actress who couldn't wait to see her friend watch her new play when she visited in December. Instead, that friend was dying in a hospital bed next to an unshaven man she just met. No less sobering was the Indian man who the postman imagined as a frequent reader of books, having no idea that as he mourned the death of some fictional character and thought to himself, "At least my friends are living," one would soon not be. The postman didn't stop crying, but he did start talking again. "I am so endlessly sorry," he said, shaking his head. "I doubt it, but if there's anything at all that I can do for you, please tell me." "Actually," said the woman, "there is." The slight sadness in her weak voice seemed ill-fit to the situation. It seemed like the minor disappointment one has when they are finishing a really good meal, more than the despair of leaving everything. "I have some letters," she said, "that I need you to deliver for me." "Of course. I can do that." "Letters to who?" the postman asked. She replied, "Letters to my lover, the man in the moon." Assuming the man in the moon was a nickname, he replied, "So, does he have an address?" "Is the moon not a clear enough address to you?" "You mean the actual moon? Like the big white rock? The moon?" "Yes, of course I mean the moon. I suppose I should have said Earth's moon. I wouldn't want you to have to travel all the way to a Martian moon. That would be absurd." "How exactly do you get to the moon?" "Oh, I have no idea. I've been all through Earth's atmosphere, but I never made it to the moon." "And where, specifically, on the moon does the man live?" He asked this question because he was not about to go to great lengths in trying to reach a strange dust orb millions of miles away from his house only to land on the completely incorrect side of it. That'd just be awkward. "Look for the lighthouse. He's a lighthouse keeper. He guides the people traveling the 8th sea. That's where I met him, actually." Now, this statement was very confusing to the postman. He was aware that there were 5 oceans, or was it 4? He couldn't remember. There were definitely not 8. Pirates in movies did tend to say that they sailed the 7 seas, though. But what was this 8th sea that the pirates didn't talk about? Was it some body of water that all the pirates just never got around to? Or was it a fantastic place where members of some alien race read books and took family photos clothed in white button-ups and khakis? "Where," asked the postman, "is the 8th sea?" "Well," she hesitated and thought for a moment. This greatly frightened the postman, who immediately assumed after 5 seconds that she had, in fact, died right before giving him crucial information. Then she started again. "It's under rocks. It's in fire. It's in your grandfather's coat pockets and Christmas presents. It's in Kazakhstan and basements and dorm room refrigerators. Its waves crash at improv shows. It's in the feeling you get listening to obscure music. It sloshes around on the last pages of books. It's full of the saddest teardrops and the saliva from the loudest laughter. It's in all these things. Perhaps it is most clear, however, in the night sky that obscures and whispers and urges us to look up. That's where I met the man in the moon, swimming in the night sky." This was not helpful, but it was quite lovely. This made the postman even more upset. Now he realized that not only had he killed somebody, but he had killed somebody who was interesting and strange. Killing what was interesting and strange is what got him into the whole mess in the first place. The postman was in an absolutely dreadful state of mind to be making potentially damning promises, but that didn't seem to stop him. "Okay," he said. "I'll deliver your letters." "Of course you will. I can't stand people who don't carry out the dying wishes of the people they hit with their vans." She pointed to a bag that hung on the hospital wall. "The letters are inside that bag. Help yourself to anything in there. I won't be needing it." He took the letters. He also took a half-full tin of Altoids. As he tossed a curiously strong mint into his mouth, he noticed a tube emerging from the woman's back, which started spewing liquid. This wasn't the only one, though. Suddenly there were many tubes spewing many different liquids all over the room. "Yes," said the woman. "This is about how I expect it to go. Read the letters. They'll tell you the story of me and the man in the moon. I'm not a very good poet, but he loved poetry, so I wrote him a bit of it. I thought it would be a nice gift to get after he finds out I've died." The walls of the small hospital room were now completely covered in all kinds of wet substances. The postman did not escape the slimy fate and was also fully soaked. He was completely in shock at the whole scenario, while the woman waited patiently to die. "Oh, here it comes," said the woman. She looked out the window and gazed directly at the fluid-splattered moon. A tear fell from her bright brown eyes. Or at least it seemed like a tear. The postman was unaware as to whether or not it had been a tear or more of whatever was gushing out of the tubes. He was pretty sure it was a tear. "I love you, Mooney. Thanks for teaching me to swim." She died. Dr. Fry came in briskly and slipped. When he was 9 years old, the postman ran away to a nearby beach after a fiery disagreement with his mother. It had been a stormy day with waves the size of automobiles and other heavy machinery. This was exactly what the child had wanted. A few punches at some of those waves to settle him down would be enough to get him to apologize. So he tramped and crashed out into the black waters. But they were worse than he had thought. It wasn't long before those truck-sized waves started to roll over him like he was a gravel road. He got turned upside down and around and back and forth in every way that a person can be moved. Just as he was resigning himself to the wave's assassination attempt, he felt a poke in his side. In a moment of brief, accidental observation, he realized it was a fishhook. In a second moment of brief, accidental clarity, He stuck that hook around his belt loop and gave the line a tug. Thanks to a strong fishing line and a stronger, hairier fisherman, the postman survived. Those moments, though, of being thrashed about and pushed around by something uncontrollable were the worst of his life. Today had felt like that day. Everywhere he turned, the postman was met with another spin, another toss, and another thrust down into hopelessness. Where was the hook this time? Surely it would come. When he got home, the letter taped onto his otherwise blank wall elevated his feelings of misery. The letter was an acceptance letter to National School of Fine Arts in Paris. It had just been a stupid why-not moment when he applied. The postman had discovered origami a few years back, and his love for paper folding turned into an ability to take slabs of drab clay and turn them into busts of weird insect men or glassy bouquets or tiny, grimy houses. It had become the thing that kept the postman going. He would come home from work and sculpt until he fell asleep at his desk with crusted-over hands. One night, the postman decided he should take the thing he loved seriously and get some real schooling on it. So he applied to 7 different art schools, mostly tiny ones. He had applied to Paris's National School of Fine Arts and Berlin University of the Arts completely facetiously, knowing he wasn't nearly that good. But surprisingly, he had heard back from all 7 of the schools, including the really impressive ones. He had taped up the Parisian letter because it scared him and excited him the most. Living in the northeastern United States, France seemed quite romantic and frightening. Now, at this moment you may be wondering why this letter gave the postman so much misery. On the acceptance letter was the date on which school would start that year. That date matched the date on the postman's tearaway calendar. He had known it was coming. 6 months ago, when he got the letter, he had thought through all the preparations he would need to make. He thought about purchasing the plane ticket, finding a place to live, saving money, applying for scholarships and financial aid, packing up all his stuff, and quitting his stupid mail job. But the months had gone by like an exhale, and the postman didn't do any of the things he needed to do. He didn't forget to do them, he just didn't do them. Today had been no different. The postman was fully aware that he had missed a fantastic opportunity. He just didn't know why he had done it. The postman had spent that entire morning crying enough tears to fill a small koi pond. As he drove his van down suburban streets, he wiped his eyes on birthday cards and notes from Egyptian pen pals. There are, however, only so many people with Egyptian pen pals, so when the last of the letters was soggy and useless, the postman had to just let the tears douse his face and blur his vision. It was during this time in which the Egyptian letters were used up and the postman's eyes had a steady fog over them that he hit the woman in love with the man in the moon. So he ripped the letter off the wall and woke up 10 hours later on the couch with it draped over his face. He took a shower. Then he cut himself an orange and let the cool citrus drizzle down his chin and onto his t-shirt. He quite liked this sensation, as it felt about as gross and reckless as he thought somebody like him should feel. So he slumped onto the kitchen tile with a handful of gushing orange slices. He ate each slice in a different way to express a different terrible action of his. He ate one like an animal, because he had done things on impulse and instinct, not thoughtfully or intentionally. He ate one like a king, because in stealing life and love and ignoring opportunity, he must have thought himself royalty. He ate one like a man because he had acted sad and confused. He ate the last one like a ghost because he had acted out of fear. Ghosts, of course, don't eat things, so the postman squeezed the last slice onto the floor until he was sitting in a sticky, sweet-smelling puddle. Being quite a mixture of pleased and disturbed with his parade of uncouth diners, the postman moved on to pondering his existence. Inevitably, pondering one's existence leads either to bleak laughter, endless crying, or a mere stillness. The postman experienced all 3 of these in order. He repeated the cycle over and 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 over again. He did this for most of the day. When his throat could barely muster a cough and his eyes were dry and crusty, the postman fell asleep again. Waking up on one's kitchen floor after having spent the day wallowing in mistakes, self-pity, and orange juice typically makes one feel the need to do literally anything other than that. For the postman, who was now without proper employment, there was only one thing to do: deliver some letters to the man in the moon. The woman had told him to read the letters, so he decided that's probably what he should do. He rifled around in his bag and found the packet of envelopes. Upon opening it, he found that there were 8 letters. All were different sizes. Each letter had a title. There didn't seem to be any real order to the letters, but he decided to start with one called When I Left Tijuana. It seemed like that one had to be the beginning, right? So he opened it up and read it. When I left Tijuana. When I left Tijuana, I was only 18. Los Angeles was mean. San Francisco was a dream. When I left Tijuana, I only had a dress, $33, and a song in my head. Sang in the streets to earn a place to rest. When I left Tijuana, the singing paid for an old banjo which made a way for me to buy a bus ticket to Santa Fe. When I left San Francisco in this manner, we drove through Arizona. The moon was a banner. It was full and bright as a jack-o'-lantern. When I left the bus, I didn't know why. Just asked the driver to stop so I could look at the sky. He dropped me off but couldn't stop the drive. When I left the bus, I felt the still. The desert was black. The silence could kill. Did I get out for the quiet or for some kind of thrill? When I left the confines of what I knew, I was terrified and fragile as a balloon. Then I looked up and saw the man in the moon. When I left the promise of somewhere, I found that sailor with a face so fair, freckled, sitting in the air. This wasn't quite enough information, so the postman unfolded another entitled Desert Wedding. Desert Wedding. As desert wind blew through my hair, for hours as we talked, I said I'd marry you right then and there, and you said you weren't shocked. So the lizards and the snakes and the rodents and the birds became our midnight witnesses while we spoke our sacred words. There happened to be a desert camper, a judge on vacation, whose coincidental proximity got him an invitation. Your best man was a cactus, my bridesmaids were the stars. They didn't tell any funny stories, but still they played their parts. The judge stood in his cargo shorts and Ghostbusters shirt. He had us make some jumbled vows that he half remembered. I said you were the one for me, you said I was the one for you. You told me that in your mind I loomed as large as Beetlejuice. You carved me a ring from moonstone, and you a ring from red rocks. Then we kissed in front of scorpions, and we've never stopped. This was very odd. Not being in the mood at the moment to think about romance, he decided to deal with the more practical side of things. After looking it up, he discovered that in a rocket it takes roughly 3 days to get to the moon. Seeing as how he did not have a rocket, he knew that whichever way he did decide to get to the moon would likely take even longer. This was problematic as his Polypodium arum needed watered at least 3 times a week. He then realized that this was, in fact, a fairly simple fix. He would merely have to leave it with his neighbor, Mr. Wax, who set off the sprinklers in his apartment nearly every other day without fail. This was due to his trying to quit smoking every Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday, while succumbing to the urges every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. On Sundays, Mr. Wax had no time for smoking as he spent the whole day with his strange, varied friend group. Every Sunday, all 6 friends would arrive at 9 a.m. and sit on Mr. Wax's damp, green Victorian couch. They would then spend each hour trying to discuss something. However, when the same people do this every week for 60 years, as these friends had, they quickly run out of things to talk about. So for the past 20 years or so, the old folks merely talked about a different object in Mr. Wax's sitting area. So, for the postman, this was a perfect situation. The plant would get all the water it could possibly need, and Mr. Wax would have something new to talk about. For often, the group would talk about a particular pair of clog-shaped salt and pepper shakers which Mr. Wax had bought on a trip to the Netherlands. Now that the plant problem had been sorted out, it was time to move on to the equally important problem: how to get to the moon. The postman thought about his high school physics class, he thought about airplanes, he thought about Air and Space Museum plaques he'd read, he thought about National Geographic articles, he thought about bats, he thought about trampolines, he thought about slingshots, he thought about jetpacks, and he thought about birds. It wasn't until he got to the birds, however, that the postman felt any sort of spark. This was not because he had a good idea concerning what birds would do to get him to the moon. It was because the postman had remembered that there had been quite a few letters in his bag which had been the perfect size to fold into paper birds. These birds would be simple ones, though the postman was capable of much more. He had often spent time creating his own designs and using unconventional types of paper. The postman spent many hours in his sculptor's studio, which was his kitchen. The kitchen had become a studio because it contrasted the rest of his apartment in that it was really lovely and wonderful. His windows would always be open, and the wind would blow his white curtains gently into the room. It smelled like saltwater summer all the time in that kitchen. There was a warmth there. He had a small group of friends he had made at local art festivals. They were some of the people who had encouraged him to apply to some schools. It was a known rule of the friends, who mostly lived in very cramped spaces on solely an artist's salary, that the postman's kitchen was always open to them every Saturday at any time. Sometimes just one of them showed up, sometimes all four, but always someone. While the postman worked on a porcelain scarecrow or folded paper velociraptors, his friends might play the trumpet or paint on tin cans or embroider sweaters. Sometimes the artist would talk the whole time, discussing abstractions and absurdities. Other times they wouldn't say anything at all. But there was a sort of nothing more to the whole arrangement. There was nothing more to be inferred, no symbol, no epiphany, no deep thought of any kind. There were merely people enjoying what they were doing and enjoying each other in a breezy kitchen, and that was fine. But they had all been accepted to art schools, and unlike him, had actually taken advantage of that. Half were in Tokyo and half in New York City. So now, with no friends around and his head full of origami, the postman grabbed the letters from his bag and started to fold. He folded 17 paper birds. They all were the same design, but had interesting inconsistencies and individualities. They did not, however, solve the problem of space travel. So, in order to distract himself from his lack of ideas, the postman decided to keep folding birds. After nearly 75, the postman grabbed what he thought was just another letter, but what was actually one of the letters to the man in the moon. He folded a bit and felt a slight quiver. He didn't think anything of it. He folded a bit more and he felt several quivers and a consistent beat. This was slightly disturbing, but the postman kept folding. As soon as he finished, the bird, now very much alive, flapped its wings and started flying across the room, running into everything in sight. As it kept on, the postman saw that it was clearly going as high as it could. It was ramming into the ceiling. It knows where it needs to go, thought the postman. It wanted to be with the man in the moon. The postman decided he had better make sure this was true, so he folded all the moon letters into birds, and sure enough, they all flew and pushed up at the ceiling. All except one, that is. The postman had taken a brown envelope, opened it up, and saw that inside there was not paper, but instead a cassette tape. It was labeled How It All Works and other stuff. Also in the envelope was a little note which read, I don't need this anymore, and a heart drawn next to it. The postman got out his old cassette player and listened to the tape. The postman heard the sound of a chair scraping a wood floor and the noises of someone sipping from a cup. There was then a sigh and a voice, which the postman could only assume belonged to the man in the moon, saying, Okay, here goes nothing. The way it works is lost on me. I don't really know why anything is the way it is. In short, the moon is a lighthouse and I'm the keeper. I keep the right parts of the moon lit at the right times and the right parts dark at the right times. I've been doing it for, well, a very long time. And even after all my meddling, the moon still does what it wants. Sometimes it wants to light up more than it should, so I can't just light it and leave. The only time I can leave is when it is time for a full moon. All of it can be lit up on those nights. It's only fully free and glad then, as am I. That's why I'm so sorry that I love you and that you have to be married to a man who is, in some sense, married to the sea. I mean, we're not married in that way. I just mean that, well, like marriage, I'm stuck with it, and well, not that I'm stuck with you. I love you. That's not the point. But I'm just trying to say that. He sighed. Sorry. I haven't talked to anyone in a long time. The point is, life with me will be tumultuous and difficult. And I know it was without me. I can't promise you peace, but I can promise you curiosity and some kind of wonder. I hope that's okay with you. Just please believe me. I'm from the black and blue. I've seen suns explode and I've hopped along the rings of Saturn. Nothing could ever be wonderful enough for me to walk away from you. There was a click and then the sound of trumpets. As Ella Fitzgerald began singing Stairway to the Stars, the postman realized that what he was holding was a mixtape. While the tape continued its ramshackle concert of jazz, rock, and folk, the postman's mind wandered. He thought about how unsure the Man in the Moon sounded. He seemed almost like a regular person. And there was comfort in that. And maybe that was the point of the Man in the Moon. Maybe that was the reason that phrase began. Maybe humans couldn't stand to have something so distant, yet so present, constantly taunting them with mysticism. Perhaps humanizing the intangible made life a little more tolerable. Perhaps they merely wanted to convince themselves that all things, even the things bigger than them, were fallible. But this thought only helps so much when a person realizes that there is something bigger than the things bigger than them, that if there is a concept of fallacy, it had to have eked out from perfection. As he thought about these things, one of the birds was defecating black ink onto his clean white socks. This disturbing event brought the postman out of his supposed reality and into his actual, though not entirely different, reality. There wasn't the time to be philosophical. It was Sunday afternoon, after all, and the postman knew one of Mr. Wax's friends with whom he had to talk. Coach Captain Dr. Almira John Quincy Adams Balewa was an Air Force pilot with a Ph.D. in astrophysics and another in ethics. She was greatly respected in the military and academia for these accomplishments. She was also the coach of a recreational senior citizen rugby team. She was greatly respected by Mr. Wax, a team member, for this accomplishment. The postman knew she would be the perfect person to ask about the birds. He burst into the room with excitement and found that Mr. Wax's friends, including Elmira, were discussing Mr. Wax's new rug, which was like one of those bear rugs where it still has the head, but instead of a bear, this rug was made up of 9 raccoons. Everyone was apparently very upset by this, and the postman thought it might be helpful for them to think on something else. So he interrupted the conversation and explained to Elmira that he recently had been given a job to deliver letters to the moon, and believed he could fly there by being carried by some origami birds, which had just recently come to life. He asked her if she thought it would work. Coach Captain Dr. Almira John Quincy Adams Balewa told the postman that his proposition demonstrated a complete disregard for the structural integrity of paper, a lack of ethical concern for the well-being and rights of sentient origami, and an outrageous misunderstanding of aerodynamics as a whole. So the postman went back to his apartment, grabbed the mixtape letter, whistled to the birds until they covered his shoulders, and hurled his body out the window. Falling. What a feeling. Perhaps there is no feeling in the world which allows us to understand our human impermanence so well as falling. Wind blowing up into our face, blowing our hair in a real sexy way, and blowing open our mouth in a real stupid one. What a stupid, sexy thing falling tends to be. As the postman fell, one of the birds flew out in front of him and unfolded. Cut my ankle on a satellite. Remember the time you said, "Oh, screw it all, it's worth the risk," and tried to bring me all the way up where air does not exist? We were somewhere lost in Africa. I kissed you on the coast. We knew the moon wouldn't be full again for another 30 days or so. Those 4 weeks would steal our June, and I think you couldn't handle that. So we climbed into your tugboat and floated up with birds and bats. We made it through the stratosphere. In the thermosphere, things were going just fine. But when we reached the exosphere, I cut my ankle on a satellite. Cut my ankle on a satellite, you threw yourself off the boat. I'd never seen you swim so fast. On your arms, I knew you loved me the most. It was just a little cut, nothing a Band-Aid wouldn't fix, but now little drops of blood rained up into the night wind. Down on the sand, you wrapped your kerchief on my ankle. When I looked up, I swear you had wings, my reckless, restless angel. We were quiet for a while. I looked across at your freckled face. I was silenced by that routine despair of 30 more you-less days. I can't live up there. Living in the sea would drown me. If only my lungs were replaced with sunlight, I wouldn't think of drowning. 238,000 miles may be a pretty long way, but the 8th sea spills right out your pockets, so I see you every day. The postman, plummeting towards concrete at an extremely stupid and sexy speed, watched as the paper folded itself back up and grabbed a hold of his shirt. Then he remembered something the woman had said. She had called the sky a sea, right? Well, the postman reasoned, a sea could be swum in, couldn't it? So he swam. And as the postman floated far above the road he had just recently thought was going to give him a full-body high five, he began to understand what the 8th sea was. Each thing she compared it to made perfect sense. Every breath was a miracle of biology and will and wind. Every sound was like those heard through a hotel window in a foreign city. Every second cost $1 billion, and the postman had never felt poorer. As the postman watched his apartment building slowly turn into a toy version of itself, everything suddenly went white. Then everything was wet. Then he heard the birds shaking off water. Then he shot up and saw what was definitely the most beautiful thing any person could see. Clouds the size of buildings going on and on and on. Dripping with the cloud water, the postman laughed and dived and spun around. He did whatever the 8th Sea's version of treading water is and just gazed. He gazed for a long time. He watched as the current Cloud City turned into an entirely different Cloud City. Then it turned into an orange Cloud City. Then the sky got very dark, and the crescent moon shone in such a way as if to remind him, saying, "You've a job to do." After one last look at the forever clouds, dusty blue and gray, he took a deep breath, hunched down his shoulders, squatted his legs, and pushed up past the planes and pigeons. As cities disappeared, Earth's curve became quite apparent. It was strange to see a fact you've been taught your whole life, but never seen direct proof of, confirmed. Of course the Earth was round. But man, the Earth was round. The postman was now at the point he had chosen not to think about. He was far too high up. He was out of Earth's atmosphere. This is where he should have stopped breathing. However, he did not. There didn't seem to be a reason for his continued sustenance. Instead of being alarmed by a lack of oxygen, the postman was instead alarmed with just how empty outer space was. He stayed put for a second. There was nothing but his heartbeat and the paper pulses of the birds. He felt only these vibrations and nothing else. He was a lonely buoy. He was a stranger. Another bird decided its turn had come to be read. Moony, moony, moony. Moony, 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 I cannot wonder if it's love. Truly, 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 you're all I think of. Blue, 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 why is that the sad color? Oh, you're my navy blue sky lover. Rush, 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 the wind all through my shoestrings. Blush, 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 your white face looks like a peach. Hands, 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 locked inside a misty nimbus. Grand, 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 there are festivals within us. After the nothingness of everything had floored him for what felt like quite a while, the postman noticed something else. The stars. They didn't all look as he had expected. They weren't at all like fairy dust or even orbs of light. Some of them seemed quite like a pentagram. In fact, most of the stars really were, well, star-shaped. As he looked closer, the postman thought perhaps they looked as though they were held in place by strings. Looking again, the postman was quite sure of the strings. The stars hung from strings which were tied somewhere out of sight. For some reason, this whole spectacle did not surprise the postman at all. It seemed quite right. Just as the earth had really been round, the stars really were star-shaped and suspended in a practical manner. While thinking of how unpredictably predictable things were, the postman felt a shiver. It was cold in outer space. Very cold. The stars seemed to get farther and farther away and appear in dozens by the second. He started to take shorter breaths. His heart began to beat faster than a trick-or-treater's fist on a door. He suddenly felt very hard-pressed to breathe a single breath at all. He was nearly choking and felt the need to throw up, and as violent shivers made his back wet with a cold sweat, he turned his head to the left and saw the earth. But in trying to push back to it, the postman felt himself dragged along by the birds toward the moon. He tried ripping at the birds, but the shivering had gotten so bad he had lost complete control of anything. There was nothing blissful about this, only loneliness and misery and confusion. The unknown no longer seemed to be some balmy ocean that the woman had described. Things were very bad out in the deep. The postman stopped fighting the birds and tried to breathe. He couldn't. Not only could he not breathe, his ears and nose went mute as well. The only function the postman had was his sight, and what the postman observed with his sole remaining sense was an expansive scene full of hidden terrors and potential misfortunes. A bird also drifted down a little way. It unfolded itself slowly and daintily. No comfort in this world. My love, you are finite. You are limited. You're bound. Sometimes even at twilight you are nowhere to be found. Other times you are a sliver, just a fragment of yourself, and all the cosmic litter doesn't really help. Sometimes the weather's cloudy, sometimes I'm stuck indoors, and sometimes you just remind me that there's no comfort in this world. Oh, your wild, starry antics, all the wind and all the twirls, though you keep me in it, there's no comfort in this world. And all the songs you write me, all the books you keep and hold, Twain and Dickens would agree, there's no comfort in this world. Yes, you fill my eyes with magic, we peer down from clouds on Istanbul, but I see only what is tragic. There's no comfort in this world. And you taught me of the simple, of slowing down and letting go, but chairs are for the crippled, there's no comfort in this world. You've opened my mind to wondering, sometimes my brain feels like a lightning storm, but it's just faint and distant thundering. There's no comfort in this world. You help me help the helpless, how fulfilling this seems at first, but soon the fulfillment becomes the impetus, so there's no comfort in this world. The ash arrives eventually, the oyster has no pearl. Another wingless century, there's no comfort in this world. When the postman observed this, he finally sputtered a breath. In, out, in, out. He could breathe now. And slowly the shivers and the nausea and the accelerating heart fell far below into nothing. Swimming, the postman thought, is not merely an activity. Sometimes swimming is survival, too. The more he spun and swirled, the closer he got to the moon. It was during this last stretch that the postman stopped having a really clear sense of either euphoria or fear. Now he was just trying to get to his destination. He wasn't sure how he felt about it. He just knew he needed to get there. And eventually, he did get there. The birds seemed excited. They started flapping their wings harder, and the postman could feel their little paper hearts beating excitedly. As he drifted down, the postman was met with how bizarre this whole thing really was. He actually killed somebody, and he actually could fly, and origami could actually live, and the man in the moon actually existed, and he was actually about to meet him. When the postman's feet touched the ground, the dust on the ground shifted a bit, and he relaxed. He had done it. The postman was standing on the surface of the moon. Also standing on the surface of the moon were a few footprints. He looked up from where the footprints were, and sure enough, there was a milky lighthouse standing straight ahead. The birds exploded in the direction of the lonely structure. When he got to the door, the birds were already perched on a rickety mailbox right outside. The postman felt it would be severely anticlimactic for him to just shove in the letters and turn around, so he knocked on the door. 1, 2, 3. Nobody answered. The postman immediately panicked as he realized these could have been old footprints, or even more disappointing, they could have been Neil Armstrong's. The postman was quite upset, so he knocked again. 1, 2, 1, 2. Nothing. At this point, the postman did something that, while it is upsetting, was something that nearly anyone who had lived the week the postman had would have done. He opened the door. Against the far wall of the circular room was a desk which was cluttered in pieces of paper and fishing hooks and a log book. Next to the desk was a stack of shelves canopied by flashing Christmas lights. One shelf held all sorts of strange items such as a cactus, binoculars, and spools of fishing wire. Two of the shelves were full of books of all colors, shapes, and sizes. The postman read a few of the titles on display. There was Crimson Stockings, The Historical Importance of Red Socks Through the Centuries, by Peter Stubb. There was also A Guide to Fishing for the Space Monkey, by, apparently, Cthulhu himself. There was a book by somebody named Thelma McNumpase, and another by John Frostbite. The last title he read was So Long and Thanks for All the Fish, by Douglas Adams. To the right of the door was a fireplace full of gray wood and a red chair that looked to be as old as the rock it lived on. Next to the chair was a table which held a radio and an empty bottle. In the middle of the room was a kitchen table with 2 chairs and a vase which held extremely wilted flowers. The last area of the room, which was to the left of the door, consisted of a little kitchenette which held a stove, an oven, a sink, and a refrigerator which plugged into nowhere. The sink held a soapy mug with a fork dropped inside of it.
On the stovetop was a cold tea kettle and a grimy frying pan.
From a wire on the ceiling hung a single light bulb which was shaped like a star. All over the walls were framed artworks and maps and other odds and ends. What really caught the attention of the postman, however, was the thing above the fireplace. Mounted like a deer above the mantel was a giant insect head. As the postman admired how interesting it was, he realized he had seen it before. Not only had he seen it before, but his were the hands which poked every hole and shaped every appendage. The postman rushed up to it to check the box of the wooden plaque it was mounted to, and sure enough, burned into the wood was his signature. Here, 238,900 miles from home, was something intensely personal and important to the postman. He tried to think back to where he had sold it. He remembered bringing it to the New England Craft Fair. He also remembered selling it, but he couldn't quite place the face of the person who had bought it. All of a sudden, the postman remembered exactly the face, or really faces, of the people who had bought this sculpture. This is not because the postman had a good memory or because he kept a detailed account of his personal commerce. The reason is because he recognized a voice behind him which asked simply, "Who are you?" The face was a very scrappy, very freckled, very pale one. Atop the round head was a captain's hat blacker than the deep void the postman had lived in since he had killed the woman. Blacker still than the inky feces of the paper birds. The man wore a long, woolly coat with large buttons running down the center. Under this coat, he wore a thick black and white striped shirt. There didn't seem to be a single hair on the man except for a pair of midnight eyebrows. On his legs was a fairly well-fitted pair of pants, the same color as the coat and hat. On his feet, the man wore nothing but skin and more freckles. The man wiggled his toes awkwardly. It was at this point that the postman realized he, a home intruder, was just asked a fairly innocent question by the homeowner, and instead of answering the question immediately, he had proceeded to look the homeowner up and down for about 30 seconds, and was, at this moment, staring at said homeowner's naked feet. So the postman answered the question. He told the man all about the origami and the art schools and the soggy Egyptian letters and the accident and the hospital room, the quest to deliver the letters and the death of the woman. Being so consumed by the recounting of his story, the postman was halfway through the orange-eating part before he noticed that the man in the moon was sitting at the kitchen table with his head in his hands, crying. It wasn't a particularly loud cry, hence why the postman hadn't noticed it. But it was nonetheless very uncomfortable for the postman who, due to the spectacularity and wonder of the past few days, had mostly forgotten that he had killed somebody who meant something to other people. He had also mostly forgotten that this whole journey was not about him at all. The whole point was that he had killed somebody and that that person needed someone to tell the bad news to the person she loved in the best way she could think to do it. Regardless of if the postman learned some lessons along the way and would likely experience permanent change from the strange happenings, he was just a tired man from Maine trying to make himself feel better by doing the one thing the person whose life he had taken had wanted from him. The postman looked away from the grieving man, pointed the birds to the table on which they quickly perched, and headed out the door away from the first settlement of the final frontier. After several hours of trekking over bleached hills in his thin Chuck Taylors and total lack of oxygen tank, he arrived at what he somehow knew to be the Sea of Tranquility. The postman decided to go for a swim. Now, of course, the Sea of Tranquility has no liquid in it, but neither did, it seemed, the 8th Sea. So he stripped down to his underwear and dove into Mare Tranquillitatis. The postman did not, however, find himself refreshed and soaked. Instead, he felt a throbbing in his hands and the chafing of moon dust along his body. How absurd. How hilarious. As he started to smile, little pebbles stuck to his gums and the rest of his sweaty skin. He began to laugh as he turned onto his back with a face completely covered in white dirt. For only a moment, with his hands on his forehead and tears in his eyes, clarity and confusion were synchronized and lovely. He was a lonely, shirtless circus clown laughing at a billion stars. And that was okay. With fairly bruised and bloodied hands, the postman knocked on the lighthouse door. The man in the moon opened the door, smiled, and said, "Come in." The man took a seat at the dining table, and the postman took the other. There were no longer any birds on the table. Instead, there were several flat pieces of paper next to a steaming mug of something black and inconspicuous. Before the postman could say anything, the man in the moon picked up a letter entitled My Man in the Moon and read aloud. My man in the moon. Man in the moon, I can see you tonight. I can see your face, I can feel your light. It glows over me, slitted through blinds like an imprisoned zebra, illumined myriad of stripes. How pretty you are, how much I ache. Why do you have to be so far? I miss touching you, I miss the drum of your heart, miss the rocket fuel smell, miss talking to someone smart. I know you don't love it up there in the sky, and I still wish for and covet every grain of the sand with which your life's hourglass is entrusted. To the time I wish we could spend, a desert couldn't do justice. But keep smoking stardust in your ivory pipe, keep doing what you must, light up the sky, so lovers can kiss beneath you and astronomers' bills will be paid, and little boys can see bats in a rush. I miss you, my friend, I miss you quite badly. I feel my guts have been taken and my soul pickpocketed. My mind feels spent and my bones pawned away. And all the good that I know I seem to forget. So perhaps I have grown to hate that moon with its strange pale arms wrapped around your shoes, clenching and hoarding and draining our time. But no matter how much I fight to make it reduce, I'm crazy for craters, insane for space, and always forever a loon for the moon. When he finished reading, the man in the moon sighed a quick and sad sigh. I loved her, said the moon man, more than I've ever loved anything, and I've been around for a lot of things. She made me very happy. The world is colder now, but it's always been colder in the 8th sea, and when you're stuck in that cold, you begin to resent it. But she never did. She reminded me how wonderful it was. I'm so afraid that without her I will not be happy again. I hate that she is gone. I forgive you, what else would I do, but I hate that you took her from me. And I can see in your eyes now that you understand how that's possible. A trip through the 8th sea tends to give people that look. I am very grateful that you brought me these pieces of the best thing that's ever happened to me, regardless of why it was you specifically who brought them. You are brave for venturing here, and I do want to hear the rest of your story, but I must ask, why are you in your underwear? The postman answered that question, and then he answered more questions, and then he asked a lot of questions. The postman ended up staying 3 days. They spent many hours drinking the strange dark liquid which the postman found out was called void milk. It tasted like smoke and bitter coffee and mint, and it was perfect. They spent many hours fishing in craters, discussing the bigger thing, and catching nothing. In those 3 days, the postman and the man in the moon became fast friends, but the postman knew he had to leave. He had work to do. They decided that he must leave the way he had come. They needed to send a letter to somebody, and the postman knew exactly where to send it. They wrote out a letter all about the 8th sea, which they decided was likely the life force of an origami letter, on a very large piece of paper. The paper was quickly folded into a paper hawk which soared into the wire which held the starlight bulb, sending it swinging across the room. They embraced each other as two sailors on a mutual sea, one a prisoner and one just a child, both with a lot left to explore. As the postman hopped onto the paper hawk, he yelled back to the man in the moon, "You'll visit me, right?" "Of course. Somewhere in Maine, yeah?" "Not anymore. Find me in Berlin." There had been one more letter the postman had read during the 3 days he spent with the man in the moon. While the hawk flew him through meteoroid streams, the letter's words played gently in his head. As I decompose. You've read all these letters, and I'm dead. Wasn't the flu or a bullet in my head. But one thing is certain, I've died. Didn't mean to, and I never would have tried. But now you're left in a house, a place by the sea with not so much as a mouse. I'm sorry that I had to die at all, but I did because things tend to die in the fall. So what now for you, man in moon? Immortality, I know, wasn't something you'd choose. But let me remind you of what somebody said, a dead thing can't die so long as it lives in your head. And while that is mostly nonsense as I decompose, I think the odd calm in me can carry you like a boat. You get knocked around living in the 8th sea, so hold fast to the mast of my memory. And sail me to places pirates fear, take me to Mars or just round the pier. The point is keep going, and as for life, just live it. Dead things are dead. I've no need to be cryptic. Sing all the music and read all the books, find curiosities in unknown crannies and nooks. The 8th sea has so much more to explore. I hear they don't know what lies on the ocean floor. You have so much more to do, I just know. Don't give up. If you love me, you won't. Look for the bigger thing which I found. I'll see you again if you can stop trying to figure it all out. Don't play with fire or run with scissors, and don't cross the street while the mail's being delivered. I love you and hope you'll love everyone you meet. Life with you was a Sunday, and you were the breeze. The bird swooped into a German thunderstorm. The postman wasn't worried about the myriad of affairs one must get in order before moving to Europe. Instead, he and the hawk signed a lease on the incidentally empty apartment whose Berlin address he had selected at random when writing that letter. He called Berlin University of the Arts and confirmed that he would be in classes the next day. Then he went to a nearby shop to buy a razor, an orange, and a German to English dictionary. That night, the postman shaved his face, smiled at the troubled but happy man in the mirror, and studied the German language in his empty apartment by the light of the moon.